You're all set, Carol.
Great. Good evening. I call to order the January 18th meeting of the Needham Finance Committee, has been our custom since the end of the COVID-19 emergency. We're hosting this meeting in a hybrid fashion, so there may be participants on Zoom, and citizens are permitted to listen to the meeting, but not to participate in the meeting. Are there any citizens?
Anybody online?
Okay. Great. So the first, we are not going to be able to approve the minutes of last week's meeting in this session. So our first agenda item is the school's budget. And with that, Josh, would you like to
Sure.
make an introduction?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So we, Mr. Shetty, myself, and John Connolly, we met with school department and school committee 3 times, December 14th, January 3rd, and yesterday, January 17th. And we reviewed the request, changes from last year, and several other questions that we raised. So I just want to give a brief summary, and then the superintendent and his team can present it. So the fiscal year 2024 budget request is in the amount of $92,155,973, which increased by 5.6% or $4.88 million over the current budget. Broadly speaking, this increase accounts for cost of living increases for staff, hiring of 13.33 full-time equivalents positions to maintain level services, amounting to 2 kindergarten TAs for increased enrollment, 7.41 teachers in special education, English language learning and nursing, 2.8 FTE equivalents for special education practitioners, 0.6 literary specialist teachers, 1.06 specialist area teachers such as world language and social studies, 0.4 for expanded elementary principal positions at Elliott and Mitchell. And then there's an additional FTE, which is a program improvement, which is the director of guidance district-wide. Notable is the out-of-district tuition expenses, which I'm sure the superintendent's team will discuss. So that is projected to increase $1.3 million, though that's not all funded through this the tax levy. Some of it is funded through other sources as well. In terms of enrollment, there's been a decrease in enrollment since the pandemic. So the first year after the pandemic saw a drop of 221 students, or 3.9%. Since then, enrollment has slowly recovered. And the town's demographer, McKibben, I believe, is still scheduled to present his findings next Tuesday. Forget the time and locations of
5 o'clock, and it's going to be via Zoom.
perfect. That forecast shows that total enrollment will recover to pre-pandemic levels by 2035. So it's slowly recovering, and that potential could change with assumptions. So it's not set in stone, but I guess we'll hear more on Tuesday. Notable though is that the percentage of students receiving special education, which is any students on an IEP, an individual education plan, has increased. So now it's 18.2% of total enrollment, which is the highest in the past 6 years. There's still the lingering effects of COVID, which includes increased student need pertaining to emotional and mental health. We discussed the collective bargaining a little bit. 3 of the units are up for negotiations this coming year, and finally with the contract. If we want to get into more details, we should probably have an executive session to discuss those at a later date. In addition, as I alluded to before, in addition to funding from the tax levy here, the school department is eligible to be reimbursed for a portion of its special education costs through state circuit breaker funds. For the past several years, the state has reimbursed 75% of costs, but the state always retains discretion to adjust that downward. So this budget assumes a 70% reimbursement rate, and it anticipates that circuit breaker receipts at that rate will be $3.15 million. And that amount, $493,000 is budgeted to partially fund this increase in out-of-district tuition. And lastly, I guess as a reminder, and also we have some new members. So this line item is for salary wages, exclusively operating costs for salary and wages expenses obviously tuition, all sorts of things related to operations. There are other aspects of the budget, such as health insurance for employees. That's in another line item of the budget. On townwide expenses, building maintenance is in another line item, primarily in DPW. So that's just something to keep in mind. With that, I'll hand over to the superintendent.
Okay, thank you. I do have a presentation. Actually, Josh has done a nice job kind of providing an overview. Thanks, Dave. It may be helpful, actually, if a few folks could introduce themselves, because I think there's some faces in the room. So we'll begin with,
Ann Galati, Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations.
Mary Lamb, Assistant Superintendent for Student Support Services. Alexandra Montes McNeil, Assistant Superintendent for University. Carmen Williams, Assistant Superintendent for Instruction and Innovation.
and we,
Leslie, School Committee.
Elisa Scatcherd, School Committee.
Andrea Longo Carter, School Committee.
Michael O'Brien, School Committee. Matt Spangler, School Committee.
Connie Barr, School Committee.
okay, thank you. Well, thanks for letting us provide this overview, and happy to try to answer questions that you might have. So we'll get right into it. Right into it. What am I doing, Dave?
You may have to scroll down.
There we go. Okay, I can do that. So let me just can we shrink that to fit the screen? Is that possible? Do I have to do that?
You have control of everything, so you don't have to use the mouse.
Well, I know I don't have control.
Sean.
Let's be really clear about here. I'm gonna have you do that just so it's a little smaller. I'm an Apple guy. I'm not.
At the top and mine is.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, right there. That will do it. That's good. Thank you. All right. Okay, so as Josh pointed out, this is really an overview of the budget plan that I've shared with the school committee, and that is a subject of a vote of theirs next Tuesday. You'll note that the bulk of the request here is for level service, which is opening the door to similar service to next year to our students, family, and staff. It's just under a 5.6% request with a little over 14.32 FTEs requested. Now, what I want you to know as well is that we began this process with the school committee with the direction, them setting priorities, and one of those key priorities was to make sure that we use the portrait of a Needham graduate and the attributes that are outlined there to make sure that our budget will allow us to provide the services and resources and the content and the personnel that we need so that our students can achieve our vision for a Needham graduate. And in addition to that, we have 4 strategic priorities that we're working on. We're in the midst of a 5-year strategic plan. 4 priorities. 1 focused on students who are driving their own learning, students experience interdisciplinary and integrated teaching and learning, students learn and grow within different and adaptable environments, and then finally that our infrastructure supports the needs of all students. So our budget has been developed with these priorities in mind. I'd like to spend a moment here, and I think actually the first part of the presentation is really trying to share with the Finance Committee that this was a challenge for several reasons in putting together this budget plan. And there's context that I want to explain in some detail. First of all, COVID, certainly the long shadow of COVID is still hanging over us, and we're dealing with that just like everyone else is in the workplace and at home. Our school demographics and enrollment continue to change. As Josh pointed out, we're down from pre-pandemic levels, but we anticipate more enrollment next year, moving back toward the pre-pandemic level. Inflation is up and costs are up for everyone. We were particularly hit by a tuition increase that I'll explain a little bit about. Staffing and wages. It's been very challenging in this environment to hire the qualified staff that we want, although we've really been aggressive and we've been successful. Trying to keep up with wages is something that's very important to us. Not to break the bank, but to make sure that we have sustainable wages for the town, but also competitive wages as well. And I think we've been able to achieve that. And finally, school infrastructure, transportation, those are areas that we really want to spend time. We have been spending time to deal with. I want to pause for a moment and thank the town, the leadership of the town manager, Karis Lustig, Barry Dulong, who have really, and Shannon Nelligan, who've really devoted a lot of time and resources to making sure that both school and town facilities are well cared for, and that there are structures and places and plans in place to deal with emergencies and to deal with the regular day-to-day custodial needs. There's been a real emphasis on that in the last couple of years. There have been funds put forward by the Finance Committee and supported by town meeting for additional structure and resources, and they are paying huge dividends for our building. So thank you for that. So let me go into some of this context. Enrollments, as I said, we defy the state. State enrollment is going down overall, and even in some local communities, Newton, Wellesley, enrollment is going down. In Needham, it's beginning to creep back up to the pre-pandemic levels, and our demographer is predicting over 60 students for next year. We'll see, we'll see where that goes and what that looks like. Our demographics have changed in over the last 10 years. Needham, I know when I first arrived, was almost 90% white.
Could you go back to the previous slide? What's the left-hand margin on that slide telling us?
The left-hand margin on the slide is
82.
giving,
That's
State
state.
I'm sorry, that's state enrollment. in
State
green.
enrollment, okay,
I'm sorry, Dick, it's state enrollment in green.
Okay,
And ours.
I
is
got you.
blue.
Ours is
Thanks.
ours, right.
The community has changed and our students have changed over time. When I first started in Needham, I believe the population of white students was around 90%, and it has over time we've become more racially diverse in our student body, as you can see, going from in 2013 83% white to now 72%. In addition, we've seen a huge increase in the number of students who come to us for whom English is not their first language. And we have specific responsibilities for these students to make sure that they're educated with the appropriate level of teachers and support so that they can be successful beyond high school. And the numbers really have really increased. Occasionally, folks are curious to know, well, what languages are these students speaking? Predominantly, the students who are coming to us are speaking Chinese, Russian, Hebrew, and Spanish. Although more recently, we've had more Ukrainian, Turkish, and Arabic students who have moved into the community. And there are a variety of other languages that these students are speaking. And for most of them, this is their dominant language, and English is something that they're learning in our classrooms.
So, Dan, so maybe you can just give a little bit of more information on that. So their dominant language is the native language that you're mentioning, and they have some proficiency in English. So how are you giving them the opportunity to learn in that classroom environment where I'm assuming most of your teachers don't have this other language proficiency?
And some of them do have proficiency in English. Some have absolutely no English. Mary, I think I may turn to you to kind of share what that broadly the English language learner program is.
We have English language learner teachers in all of our schools. Some have more staffing than others, just depending on where enrollment is. And they are charged with providing direct instruction in language acquisition. And that can happen in a quieter setting, small group or individual. And then they also support classroom teachers in their inclusion and providing instruction in classrooms. In addition to that, all of our teachers have to be what we call SEI endorsed, which simply means they have to meet credentials for their licensure to know how to adapt their learning environment for students that are just learning English.
The SEI endorsement is sheltered English immersion. And you're right, Mr. Healy, that our teachers do not have all of these language skills, although we have a fair number of teachers who have some of these skills, and we do lean on them. The goal of our program is to help a teacher, an English language learner teacher, who's working with a variety of students who may be speaking a variety of languages, and helping them adapt culturally, providing resources, both online resources and in-school resources, going with them to a class to help navigate what a homework assignment might look like or how to approach a teacher. And it's a process. It may take years for a student. But from some of our students, it's actually a quick process, especially as they start integrating with their peers and picking up English. So it's definitely become more complicated over time, but I will tell you these kiddos really enrich the school setting. A couple of weeks ago, I was wandering down the halls of the high school and there were 3 Ukrainian boys arguing about the Celtics game. Now, I only know that they were arguing about the Celtics game because they were tossing around Jason Tatum's name and they were upset with one another. But that was great to see. And there are just, more and more kids like that coming into the district. Additionally, in our demographics, special education students and students who are being identified as special education certainly has grown over the last 10 years and over time. We're about up to the state average. And this, of course, requires additional services and program support for students because most of our students, the vast majority of them, have a teacher in the classroom, but then it means hiring additional support, another teacher or a teaching assistant to work with a few students. So that when we have an increased number, that does lean on some of the resources. And in this budget, there are requests for special education resources.
And just to clarify, I think we discussed this is for all students with IEPs, right?
Yes,
So they receive all their instruction in the same classroom as everyone else.
yes. In fact, the vast majority of our special education students are fully included and they receive their instruction with our students. Also, the number of students, the trend over the last 10 years, the number of students who are considered socially or economically disadvantaged has grown in Needham. Just an anecdotal, but a piece of empirical data that when we were going through COVID and we were providing free and reduced lunches and meals for students, and we were providing them at least one location, High Rock, we would have, and we were distributing, I believe, meals twice a week on Tuesdays and Fridays. We would have 300 children come to pick up free meals on every Tuesday and every Friday. And you'd see students walking across the street from High Rock or being picked up with their bags of groceries and meals. And that was a consistent number, that 300. That has grown over time. And of course, providing supports and services for them is another responsibility we have and one we're pleased to provide. And it can be a challenge.
On this chart, it looks pretty flat, 2016 through 2020. And then it spikes. Do you think that's a reaction to COVID? And if so, what's that telling us?
I won't say that there's that's directly related to COVID. If any of my colleagues behind me have a thought about that, I can't say that it is or isn't right now. I think we need a little more time to determine. One of the things I haven't looked at is where was the town at whole, for example, around unemployment or other things. I haven't gotten into that level of detail, but that might be another data point to help understand that better. Regarding staffing, because of some investments the school committee has asked for and the finance committee supported in the town meeting, we have made some progress on our student to teacher ratio. We're not right in the middle, we're not at the top for sure, but we have over time made progress so that we have a more reasonable student to teacher ratio because the fewer students that a teacher overall can manage and work with, the idea is that we'll be better off for the child. This is a balancing act because the more teachers and staff you have, the larger your budget is. So I think we're making progress there. I think we could do a little better. This budget plan does not propose moving that at all. I think it'll essentially be where it is next year in the same place. Maybe fall back a place, but I think the school committee has been focused on this. We've been prudent about these resources the town has given us. And I wanted you to see that context for staffing.
So was FY23 in that same ballpark of 12.6?
I would, I would say,
I would
yeah,
say yes.
I'd say so, yeah,
And
because
and this current budget, which you're proposing,
it'd be
doesn't
about-
move the needle either.
Right. The only thing that will change it is if there's a huge influx of students and our staffing remains the same, but we don't see a huge influx, 50 to 60 students potentially. So we'll probably be around that ballpark. I do want to transition a little bit around staff and talk again about another piece of context for our budget, and that's collective bargaining agreements. I know that print is small, but you have a hard copy in front of you. What I want to make sure that the finance committee knows is that it's been a tricky it's been tricky out there. You know from the news that there have been communities that have confronted teacher strikes. Our school committee has been engaged with our teachers. We have 5 bargaining units, by the way. Unit A are teachers, Unit B are administrators, Unit C, D, and E are the remaining employees. Unit C, teaching assistants and technicians. Unit D, Unit C are teaching assistants and paraprofessionals. Unit D are clerical and technical staff, and Unit E are nutrition service workers. Now, Units A and B, I'll just drive down this road for a moment. Their contract ended last June. The school committee began negotiating with Alex's leadership last spring. And we came to a point in time where the contract, we believe, was settled, and it was brought forward for a vote, and the vote failed. Teachers did not support the vote. That was in late June, I want to say, sometime around there. Now, that same thing happened in Westwood and Wellesley, by the way. The teachers, though, in those communities walked away and said, we'll see you next year. The Needham School Committee and the relationship they have with the Needham Education Association leadership said, let's keep working. So they worked throughout July and came to an agreement in July, which is the agreement that you see up there. Now, that's the COLA, the cost of living allowance. There really wasn't much else in the contract, frankly. Sometimes there are other pieces in the contract, for example, a longer school day. That wasn't really part of our contract. It was mostly focused on the COLA. And I think what the school committee was able to achieve was a very reasonable, sustainable COLA for our teachers and for the community. That was not necessarily achieved in other communities, most recently Melrose, which settled on a 10% over 3 years labor agreement. And as we sit here this evening, Westwood and Wellesley still have not settled, along with several other communities. And we'll see what happens there. But the hard work of the school committee, the thought that Anne and Alex put in really helped us and our relationships with the NEA come up with contracts with Unit A and B that are fair to them, but also are affordable. They are impacting our budget for sure. And now as we enter into negotiations with Unit C, our teaching assistants, Unit D, clerical, and Unit E are nutrition service workers. By the way, those employee groups are the hardest to hire and the hardest to staff for, and our pay happens to be among the lowest in the area. We face a big challenge to really think about how we can provide competitive wages, but also one that can be sustained in a budget process. I believe the school committee will continue to do a good job as that unfolds over the spring.
Is it possible to generalize as to what the starting point was for these? For example, if we are 10% above, if Melrose is 10%, but they started 3 or 4% below us, that would
So
be relevant.
there's no question that there are some communities that are up on that table that the teachers, and I don't have all the facts, but I know in Malden, I know in Melrose, those communities were struggling to pay teachers a rate that was what they may consider fair for that neighborhood around Malden and around Melrose. Again, I don't have the details from talking to superintendents, those superintendents, from reading what we've all read in the paper. That's how I've learned that. So yes, some of those communities, in a way, this reflects a little bit of catch up. Needham has been generous with our teachers, and yet at the same time, our wages, are competitive with the area, and I think they are sustainable over time with our budgeting. The other thing that's not in here is there are other things that happened in these communities that did not happen in our budget. It's my note on the bottom. Some of these, they didn't quantify on that COLA. They decided to throw a longevity payment at teachers for, let's say, $500 or $1,000. Now, Angulotti would count that as part of the broad settlement. Other communities don't. And so when they say that for example, Melrose, I know, settled at 10%. But there are other, what we call sweeteners, in those contracts, longevity payments. There are other things like
Beyond
that,
just COLA.
beyond just COLA. And
Steps.
steps and additional
Steps.
steps. So thank you. So they may put an additional step on their scale, because if most of your teachers at the top scale, they're looking for more than a COLA, they added a step. Those are not reflected in those numbers. They are reflected in Needham's numbers, everything that, you know, we essentially have asked for. So it's tricky trying to compare all of these, but I just wanted you to have that context of where we are and where we're trying to go. I also wanted to point out to
Before we
you,
go on, can I?
yeah.
just a couple of quick ones, Dan.
sure,
So, this unit A, unit B settled when?
over unit A settled in the summer and unit B in August and September.
So, but just recently, in the
Yeah.
last 4 or 5 months,
Yeah.
okay. And was any of that in the special town meeting in October in terms of the impact to prior budgets? In other words, was that settlement, I see the years 23, 24, 25. Is that the 3 years that are impacted by that settlement?
So the settlement that we had for, that we made with our teachers in July and with our administrators in September, that was part of our FY 23 budget. So anything that town meeting appropriated last May, whatever they got was included in the budget.
Oh, so even though you didn't have a settlement yet,
That's, well, we have to. I mean, we're in that process right now. We're developing this FY 24 budget.
well, sometimes we put the money elsewhere. We
Oh.
put it in townwide expenses, and we put it in another area, we park it.
Got it.
Recognizing that there may be, a requirement to fund it.
Right. No, and in our FY 24 budget, we're taking a guess at where we're going to settle with unit C, D, and E. And of course, that'll be a negotiation to make it.
And so right now, there's no obligation on us to catch up any of the funds that are now going to be implicated by these two settlements. Is that right? Okay, sorry, thank you.
Wanted to provide some additional context around special education staffing. Because this budget does request a few folks for our continued growth in our special education programming. And again, data from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. You can see that, again, being prudent and thoughtful about how we use our resources, that we do have among the highest ratio of special education students to special education staff. And one of the specific things in this budget, we propose to add a special education teacher full-time to Mitchell, which has among the highest caseloads of teachers, of students to teachers. And then there are some other special education resources for different special ed programs within the district. But a move like that, if supported, adding a teacher to a school, because we're very careful about how many caseloads and what they look like and trying to balance them, will have a direct impact, a positive impact on the Mitchell community. Nonetheless, as you can see, we've been really tight with our staffing as compared to other communities. I want to talk a little bit about special education out of district students. You know that there are approximately 80 students, 78, 80 students for whom we are unable to provide a program within the town of Needham for certain special education students. And they are either at a day program where they come and go and we provide transportation, or they're in a residential facility if they have really significant needs. And that population has generally been stable over the last several years. How many, the percentage of students who are out of district in these placements. We've been able to build programs in the district to make sure that we keep as many students in the district as possible. But those programs are intensive. They require space and they require staff. We lack a lot of extra space. And staff is something that we have to come to the budget process for to make sure that we have the staff we need for them.
Do you have a percentage of what the cost implication is? If you just look at an out of district placement as opposed to being able to do it in district? What is the plus? If you have it.
How would you answer that? Yeah.
Give me a moment and I'll be able to
Yeah,
quantify some.
fine.
Okay. I'll keep moving along here. Now, one of the things I do want to talk to you about is special education tuition increase, which is significantly impacting this budget. And this requires a little primer here. Let me go back up here now that Dave has taught me how to use this. So there are about 100 private special education schools offering about 200 different programs in the Commonwealth. And there are private special education schools outside of Massachusetts. We send about 78 students or so to both collaboratives and private education schools, most of them to private education schools. And these are wonderful schools, by the way. On the whole, they're wonderful schools who are providing amazing service. The Walker School is an example of one of those amazing schools. They can't just raise tuition willy-nilly. Someone, there has to be some control over that. And so a long time ago, many moons ago, the governor's office, the Secretary of Administration and Finance, has a little office tucked inside. Actually, it's an influential office, the Operational Services Division, and they're responsible for setting rates. Actually, there's one person who's in charge of the special education tuition. So I'll say she is responsible for setting the rate for tuition. And then they pass that on to districts. There's also another mechanism. They can say, a private special education school can say, we have got tremendous issues. We have more students coming in. We have to build an extra classroom. We have employee issues with salaries. We need extra funding. And so they can petition to receive additional funding. One of the schools where we send a couple of students on the Cape has requested this, what do we call the special funding? I forget what it's called.
It's like a restructuring increase.
Restructuring increase. Received a 60% increase on their tuition for next year. That includes the additional tuition increase that I'll talk about in a moment. So they go to the office and say, we have these needs, and they either approve it or don't. And then that is just passed on to us. And we accept it because our students are enrolled there and they need the programs. So the OSD, though, this past year, they and from my view, and these are my words, with really, I think, a lack of transparency, any process. I know there was very little, if any, collaboration with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. They unilaterally said, we're going to increase tuition by 14%. Now, to put that in perspective, this is what their increases have been over the last 10 years. They've averaged about 2%. But for this coming year, they've decided, because special education private schools were saying they were struggling with labor costs, that they were going to impose a 14% tuition hike. And that's basically baked into the new governor's budget. That's a thing that's going to happen now. That 14% represents about $900,000 to $1 million to our budget. So if we had a typical 2% increase, a more typical 2% increase for FY24, we could have reduced the special education tuition line item by about $900,000. And presumably our budget request would be that much lower. However, we're dealing with this. Now, I will tell you that we are, Ann and I have been very much involved in advocacy with different state leaders. Our legislators are aware of this. It will be great if they bake something into the FY24 budget that will address this, but that's not going to impact us right now because the state's budget won't be passed until July, and this budget will already have been, hopefully, presumably appropriated by town meeting. And then the school year will be starting. And so if there is any extra money, it will come through, we don't know.
We hope, and we have some signals that the governor is looking to provide some kind of relief in the budget in FY24. Circuit breaker will cover this increase, but not until FY25.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So I don't know if it would be the governor or the legislature. that
Or
would
the
do it. I
legislature,
think the
right.
legislature is probably the more likely partner. And in fact, Matt Spengler and Andrea, Ann and I are going to be meeting with legislators in Newton later next month, along with superintendents from around the area and school committee folks to talk about how the legislature can address this. Because if it's $1 million in Needham, Boston's numbers got to be bananas, and every other community is impacted by this.
the superintendents and the school business managers and the Association of School Committees have been active for a number of months now, with letters and information to the state and to the legislature about the impact.
I'll say this one last thing and then I'll get off of this, because these schools, and this is there are two things I'll say. These schools are important to us because they serve our kids and they do overall a great job. There are a couple programs out there that may not be the greatest program, but the places our children go to really service our children well. And so we want them to be successful. So please know that. The other thing, though, is that if you look on the website for these private special education schools, they're offering bonuses to bring people on board, $10,000, $5,000. We're not doing that. We can't do that. So it's a bit galling that they're getting this increase and continuing to offer these bonuses to bring people on board. And it's impacting what we have to do here.
Excuse me. Are they so understaffed that they have to do that? I mean, what's the genesis?
There
of
is
the-
no question that staffing in special education programs, public and private, has been a huge challenge. We have about 16 positions, some of them special education, probably the majority of the special education teaching assistants, for example, we've not been able to hire for yet this year. Or we've hired folks, Mary knows this well, and they are overwhelmed with the responsibility and they've left us. We've had a bit of a revolving door in a couple of positions. And that's happened not just in Needham, it's happening all over and maybe in your places of employment where people are turning over or you're just not able to attract people to the role. The other part of the equation, as I mentioned earlier, is that we have to in Needham look carefully at what we are offering as far as pay because we are not as competitive as our neighbors. And so that's an impact on what's happening. As far as the private special education schools, anecdotally, I know they're having some of the same pressures. But I don't know all the details about what they're trying to do. I don't at all believe that a significant increase is unwarranted. My solution is to phase it in, not just clobber everybody with it in 1 year. You had the answer to Jim's question?
Jim, in fiscal 21, which is the latest data that DESE publishes, the amount of in-district expenditures per pupil in Needham is about $20,200. In-district expenditures. The price of a tuition out of district can range anywhere from approximately $40,000 at one of our collaboratives to $300,000 for a very expensive placement. And it's all about whether it's a residential placement, whether it's a day placement, what the nature of the disability is, what the amount of support services are. It varies by child.
And transportation. on top.
And transportation is an
Transportation is
additional
huge
charge on top of
expense.
it.
Huge expense.
I recall that was one of the missions that 10, 15, 20 years ago. There needed to be an effort for Needham to make as few out of district as possible, just because of the economics of it.
And well, first of all, it's the best thing for the child to be at home and in the community. And then economically, we can provide, if it's possible, we have the space and we have the staff, we can provide some intensive programming. We do that at Sunita Williams, we do that at Newman, we do that at Elliott, we do that at Broadmeadow in particular, and at High Rock Poly and the middle school. At the high school. So I'll just kind of recap here that the proposed budget increase is, as I said, $4.8 million. Some of the, another way to look at it, that level service and contract is the bulk of the request, a small amount for program improvements. I guess the DRS4s, right, on the town side, same equivalent. DRS4s, that's the equivalent. Just unpacking some of the requests, we're looking for some teaching assistants for our kindergarten enrollment, which certainly spiked in this past year. We are looking for special education teachers, English language learning teachers. That's the bulk of this request, 7.41. Student service paraprofessionals, board certified behavior analysts for students with autism, for example, literacy specialist teachers, special area teachers, for example, in fine and performing arts, an increment of a teacher, 0.1 for a theater teacher at the high school to meet some growing demand. I mentioned also the director of counseling at the secondary level to help us implement our mental health task force plan, develop our social emotional learning program. So those are the 14.3. And one of the things you should know is that we do look at our budget. We do look at it to see can we repurpose or redirect funds, and we did that with this budget. We were able to redirect folks, teaching assistants and teachers into newer positions that we propose for FY24. So we're not just saying just add on to this, but we may have new needs with folks who've been around because the students' needs change. So we're trying to reposition people to meet new needs. There are additional resources requested in there, a subsidy for the athletics program. Without the subsidy, we would have to raise the fee for students. And the school committee is trying to avoid any additional fee increases if possible. There are some stipends in there for different co-curricular activities. We're excited to be able to ask for the other half of funding for the Summer Bridges program. Summer Bridges program came as a result of the pandemic, actually. We wanted to provide a summer enrichment for students who needed extra support, and it's become wildly successful, and we want to continue that program in the summer. Additional software upgrades and expenses and things of that nature. An additional yellow bus to help provide for more seats for kids who are riding the bus. And then in the area of curriculum instruction, we're looking for some pieces around the state is now requiring an early literacy screener for K through 2 and also 3 students. Looking for some funding to support our growing social studies program, a world language assessment program that's helping our students in Mandarin, in Spanish, and in French. And then some increased support for the arts and activities, an a cappella advisor, some Best Buddies advisor, a Gay Straight Alliance advisor at the middle school, some athletic stipends and music and theater arts staffing for those programs, which are really growing in our Pollard and at the high school.
And before you go, I just want to, it is all of these items, the proposed increases for curriculum, the district resources requests. Is that included in your proposed budget, or are those DSR4s or?
That's all included in that bottom line. Those are all part of program.
93 million includes everything that you have in.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now we have, pardon me?
Said what it doesn't do.
This is what it doesn't include. We have some principals and program directors who have all kinds of ideas, and they have some great ideas, but we have to balance what we can reasonably do. So there's some pieces that we're going to need to phase in and defer for another year. But we'll continue to innovate and do what we need to do. But what I can finally say, and this is my last talking point here in the last slide, is that I do believe this program, first of all, it addresses the priorities that the school committee had laid out in August when we met. It does build capacity in our special education, specialized programs, particularly at the preschool, at Sunita Williams, and at Pollard Middle School, so that we can do a great job with our kids, keep them in district, and support them until they graduate. It offers new summer programming for our students. It will support sustainable and competitive wages, which is really key right now. We do manage to redirect existing funds to meet new needs because we want to be thoughtful about that. And then finally, I think that all of it allows our district to continue to prioritize equity and inclusion, all of which are the framework for our strategic planning. So with that, Madam Chair, members of the Finance Committee, I'll be quiet for a moment. And it is a little bit like drinking water from a fire hose, I know, when you come to this budget. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have now. And we're certainly welcome to come back again later on as you continue your deliberations and the rest of the winter spring.
I only had, there was one, I think the only thing that I didn't see covered, this was a very good presentation. I had read the December 13 presentation, is the enrollment. So I understand you said that you're expecting maybe another 60 students coming in, and enrollment, which at one point might have gone down a little bit, you expect is now going to come back to pre-pandemic. So I understand that those comments, but in terms of numbers, if you don't have them immediately, you can just send them to us. I'd just like to know, you must have it probably somewhere like on the top of your bulletin board. Last 10 years, where are you in terms of enrollment? And if you could do it both, break it down by the old high school, middle school, and elementary school.
Sure, we can do that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're I'll actually just pass this around right now. I only have one copy of it, but this lets you know, you want to look at that and pass it around to you. That lets you know what enrollment has been over the last, I forget when that begins. Was it
2006, 7.
2006-7. Where enrollment,
So that would be fantastic, and if you
break it down by level.
if you could,
Sure.
and again, I'm not
Sure.
trying to make work, but
No, we can do that. That's not a
it would
problem.
help me better understand.
Yep. Yep, we can do that. Yes.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
In the context of the projected additional positions 14.3, how are we doing this year in terms of hiring relative to the budgeted number of positions for this year? Are we filling them, or?
So we have, I'm going to say as of probably this week or so, Alex, we have about 15 or so positions that need to be filled. Now, that's not, 15 is a lot, but on any given year, there are positions that we have open because people have come, they've started, they decided that this wasn't their gig and they moved on, and so we post the position again. That's kind of the normal course of business. It has been a struggle to hire teaching assistants, drivers, done a little better, but just a little better with nutrition service workers. Again, part of that's the pay issue, but part of it is, something, the world is reorienting itself after COVID. I think in all of your roles and responsibilities you have, we're learning that. We're learning that, for example, our van drivers and bus drivers, that used to be a kind of a retirement job for some folks, but now folks have said to us, I'm not interested in getting a bus with a bunch of kids. That's it. I'm not going to do that. So we have a couple positions open there. Now, what that means though, is that we still have to move the kids. So then we contract out at huge expense, a few $100,000 this year, to contract for something that we could, take care of for far fewer dollars if we were able to hire those employees. But these contracted services right now, they have you over a barrel. And so we've got to get the kids to school, and that's what happens. Regarding teaching assistants, one of the things I appreciate Mary and Alex have thought about with our principals is, what if we traded in, if you will, a couple, 2 or 3 teaching assistant positions for a professional staff member, teacher, a special education teacher. We have done that, and I pointed that out in the slide a couple times. We don't seem to have a problem in hiring professional staff. Part of it is because it's needed, and I think people want to work in our community, although it's still a struggle all over the place. There aren't as many going into the education field as there used to be, but we are able to really vet and bring into the district certified staff, professional staff, teachers, where we're struggling with teaching assistants. So we're trying to be creative, Dick, to get to your question. We are having some success, and we're still struggling a bit.
Looking at this chart of your projected hires, where are the ones that one would reasonably expect? Well, that won't be a struggle, and this is an area where it could be a struggle.
So over 10 of those are certified staff, which we haven't yet had trouble hiring. I do think.
This is up to 14.33 there.
Yes,
Okay, 10 are staff. Okay.
Yeah. I didn't count it exactly.
average cost 80,000 all in, or
I
A
think
little bit
the,
less.
a little bit less.
Chair, can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
So this is more general, and so we've had this discussion about road circuit breaker before in our liaison meetings. But I want to preface it by saying I'm committed to the school department to have the operational resources they need. So this question is about the sources of funds only. So do you have this in front of you? These are.
no.
So these are figures that I collated from documents provided by the school department. And corroborated by DESI. So in each year, for the past 3 years, fiscal 20 through 22, it shows the new reimbursements from circuit breaker. The amount carried forward to the following fiscal year, because circuit breaker is allowed to be carried over for up to one fiscal year. And then just for reference, the turn back. So any dollars in the operating budget that aren't spent at the end of the fiscal year get turned back to the town. And just what I noticed is that there's a lot in these 3 years, perhaps that was an aberration because of COVID, but in these 3 years, there's a lot of circuit breaker funds that were carried over to the next year and not spent in that year
Mhm.
to when they were received. Is that a conscious decision? Is that, and could you explain the reason for that? Because if there are outside funds, like circuit breaker funds that could be relied upon instead of taxpayer dollars, that in my mind would be preferable.
Mhm.
But there could be other reasons why that's not the way.
Sure. As we discussed in our meeting, we are required by the state to budget fully for circuit breaker, meaning that we estimate our tuition. We are required to reduce that estimate by the amount of anticipated circuit breaker, and then that net request is the request that we make to the local taxpayers for the balance. We always intend to budget and fully expend our circuit breaker in the year that we receive it. In the COVID years, which started in fiscal 20, but really were in FY 21, and then to some extent, or to a large extent, really in FY 22, which was sort of responding to the pandemic, we were anticipating needs that were several $1 million in excess of what we were budgeted for. And in the fiscal year 21, for instance, it was all of the hybrid, the remote learning academy teachers, all of the additional expenses related to tents and to testing and to providing the resources for all of those things. We received a number of federal COVID-related grants, but that did not cover the full extent of those costs. So we were able to use circuit breaker because we had some remaining surplus in our budget from the prior year. We were able to expend those dollars for tuition, which allowed those circuit breaker resources to carry forward. And although we have to spend them on we spend those dollars on special education needs, it allowed us to free up some money in the budget that we could then pair with those COVID-related grants to meet those COVID-related needs. So in FY 21 and 22, we were really looking at a sizable, it was millions of dollars actually in excess of budget that we had to provide supports for students. In FY 22, it's a lot of the summer bridges and things along the lines of providing educational resources to children who had struggled during the learning period. So we anticipate now that we do not have that need to continue to provide for COVID. In fact, one of the reductions that Dan didn't highlight in his presentation is that in FY 22, we had added an additional $180,000 to our budget for PPE and different, cleaning and sanitizing. That's not something we need in our budget, and that was actually reduced from our operating budget this year, and is one of the things that sort of netted against some of those other increases. So we don't anticipate those same level of COVID needs. And one of the, I think that things that are driving some of the special education and student supports are just to make sure that those ongoing supports are part of our ongoing operating budget. So at this time, we don't have that need. In June, we may find, for instance, that our special education tuition estimate, out of district tuition estimate is $400,000 or $500,000 in excess of budget. We don't have any contingency built into our budget for out of district tuition or any of those expenses. At that point in time, we'll evaluate whether there's any additional remaining salary savings in the budget from some of the positions that we didn't have that will allow us to carry forward some money to the next year to meet those out of district tuition needs. But we evaluate that in June or in May at the end of the year. If there are needs that are in excess of budget, that's what that really is for. And in COVID, those were just really large dollars.
And one of the other needs we had this past year was we had to hire 2 kindergarten teachers. Kindergarten teachers.
Right,
because
the
of
enrollment may come in higher
Yeah.
than the 60, if we get 80 students instead of 60, we may have to hire an additional classroom teacher in excess of budget, and that could be a source of funding for it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps, but it's to finance things in excess of the budget as opposed to unexpected things.
That helps, I guess. So for next year, we're expected to receive 3.156 million in circuit breaker. And that's added to the 1.655 that was carried over from last year, fiscal 22. So it's out.
So the $1.6 million will be spent this year. We cannot carry that forward for an additional year. It
Correct.
will be spent before June 30.
Correct. So I guess I'm saying, it seems like there's like a knock-on effect of, since there was an extraordinary carryover during COVID, is there going to be going to take longer to ramp down those dollars?
You know, we in FY22, we turned back a sizable amount. We did not carry those monies forward into FY23. We really only assess what we, if there are needs in excess of budget in May and June, that's what we're planning for. We don't carry forward money that doesn't have a purpose or isn't, discussed with.
Well, discussed with the school
superintendent.
committee and with finance committee or liaisons, have a conversation. This is how we would, this is what we anticipate and how we would like to use the dollars that we have.
So has some of that in the past been used to prepay tuition?
Well, it's really in lieu of prepaying tuition. Prepayment of tuition is another mechanism that is allowed for schools to free up money in a subsequent budget year, if you need that. For instance, if you estimate that your tuition expenditures are going to be $500,000 more than your budget, if you have money in the previous year, at the end of the year, you can prepay $500,000 worth of tuition. That frees up that money in the subsequent year budget so that you can afford that. You always have to include that in an ongoing budget the following year, though, because those are only one-time resources. And if you have those ongoing tuition expenses, you do need your ongoing resources in order to afford them. So because we don't have those contingency dollars in our budget, that is a way that we can do that.
The alternative would
alternative.
be, I'll make it even, I hope not too simple, but simple enough for me to understand. If at the end of this school year, we have a $100,000 balance on June 30th. And we have to hire a kindergarten teacher and a teaching assistant. That costs approximately $100,000. I'm going to say to Ann, well, we have 2 choices. One, do nothing, but then we don't actually have the money in our budget to hire that teacher and teaching assistant. So we won't do that. And we'll raise class sizes and cause another problem. Or I'll say, Ann, pre-purchase $100,000 in special education tuition because we happen to have $100,000 left over. And that will free up in that line item $100,000 to hire that kindergarten teacher and a teaching assistant. Or the alternative is to not do either. Turn the $100,000 back to the town, come to the finance committee or special town meeting in October and request the $100,000. But the school year's already started. And we need to have somebody in place. So we try to, and at least for the last 17 years that I'm working with Ann, or rather that Ann has been my boss and working with me, we've been able to manage the funds that town meetings appropriated without having to go to finance.
I think one thing that's important to remember is that either way, the pre-purchase of tuition, or if you do have money that you can carry forward, those are only one-time resources. And all of the expenses within the operating budget are ongoing, sort of by their nature. So that is it's a dilemma.
Yeah, but they seem to be like one-time ongoing of varying amounts, right?
We have turned back, we have turned back money to the town. We've had funds left, generally speaking, at the end of the fiscal year. Yeah,
But
that is,
that is normal for any
Yeah.
budget to have a certain amount of turnover at the end of the year.
Would you say 3%?
The school department did turn back one of the biggest percentage turnbacks in many years, over $2 million from the FY22 budget. Whereas in some years, it's been as low as nothing.
Right, but when I met with you, you said that most of your departments on average, you'd have a turn back of somewhere around 3%.
Turnback's been about 3%. At 2%, basically, that's fully expended budget. Because you have to appropriate enough to cover all your expenses, so. And if a 2% or less turn back, basically you're fully expending the budget.
Okay,
And we are always around that
That
amount.
level.
Mhm.
and you have, I mean, I know in the past, you've also pre-purchased supplies, furnishings. Yeah, that may have been a long time ago, but I know at times you've done that for the same purpose.
and using being able to pre-purchase special education tuition for that reason. Yep. But again, those are things that, you want to be thoughtful and careful about. And you want to, one of the things we try not to do is and I know principals have needs and programs have needs, and at the end of the year thinking, geez, we can only do this. We really try hard, Ann and I try hard to say, was this part of our overall budget scheme, not a brand new thing? Because that's something that should go, into a proposal the following year. So it's got to meet an immediate and critical need, and that typically relates to teachers that we may have to hire.
Madam Chair, could I introduce- Dan, you provided us a while ago a memo, December 13th, with data on it. Looking at substitutes seems to be increasing significantly. For example, in 2021, the cost of substitute was round numbers 250,000, and it's now in the $600,000 range. Broad question. How much of that is attributable to increased salary cost per a given position, and how much of it is representing increased need for substitutes? And if it's the latter, what's driving that?
Well, there's no question there's been an increased need for substitutes because of teacher illnesses and staff illnesses due to COVID. So that's the last few years, that's just kind of been blown out of the water.
Yeah, I'm looking at fiscal 21 forward. So
What page, Dick?
this is
I don't know if
the
that.
pages aren't numbered, but
No,
I'll pass it down.
Halfway now?
Yeah, about halfway in. Expenditures by program area / department detail.
Mhm.
And it's about halfway down the general. 5 to 6 down the general service line,
That's right.
substitutes.
I see it, yeah, thank you.
Just couple of pages.
So so would you rephrase your question or reframe your question?
It's gone from round numbers 250-ish in
Mhm.
21 to this year's
Why
request
the increase?
is 600,000.
Oh.
What's driving the increase? I know a year or two ago, and maybe longer, we specifically said we need to pay more in order to get
Yes.
substitutes.
Yes.
So my
Mhm.
question was, how much of it is attributable to that versus just increase volume of need for substitute? And if it's the latter, what do we think is driving that?
I think one of the issues is actually budget versus actual. So our budget for substitutes hasn't changed significantly for a few years now. What happens is that we have two different types of substitutes. We have the substitutes that we call daily substitutes, which are you know, the folks who you call when you have a teacher absent. Those are the folks that are expensed to this line item in those actuals. And then we have long-term teacher substitutes. Long-term teacher substitutes are used when you have a teacher who goes on maternity leave, or when you have a teacher who is in the position because someone is having surgery or something. Those folks are expensed to the department that is hiring those substitutes. So although the budget for both of those kinds of substitutes is in this line item, half of the money is expensed here and the other half is expended where the teacher who is out on long-term leave is charged to. So it's a little bit of a mismatch between where something is budgeted and where it's expensed. And the reason it's expended that way is simply because of the way we have to report things to DESI.
Okay,
So
okay,
it's
fine,
not
cool.
that the budget has increased from
What's driving this line?
250 to 600,000.
What's driving this line? And is that likely to continue to grow?
So it's not growing, it's that the budget is about the same. It's about $575,000 to $600. When we expend those funds,
Take it out and stick it in the alley. So,
half of
yeah.
it is stuck here and
Yep,
half
I
of it is
understand.
stuck somewhere else, if that makes sense.
The snow and ice budget, keep it level and it varies based on.
And it's
actual-
not meant to distort anything. It's really where we,
Okay.
how we have to
2020,
report to the state.
2021 and 22, since those are actual. That's why those numbers look like they are. And then
It's
20
actual for daily subs
Right,
only.
Right. But
Those
then,
long-term subs are charged
What you're
to
saying, is there's probably
Broad
another
Meadow,
couple hundred
Ellen,
thousand.
right. They're
But
charged
top
other
of that.
places.
but they're in the budget.
They're in the budget and
Right.
they're in the actuals. They're just not
And then
charged
the
for
next
that
year, they'll end
specific
up being-
department. I'm sorry that was confusing.
That will teach me to get smart.
That's part of, feels like 20% of my job is just figuring out where people, you know,
Yeah.
what the substitutes are and how much we're gonna pay and.
I think we discussed also that subsidy program at the high school changed a bit. In part because
Yes.
it's difficult to recruit.
Yeah, it's still, teaching assistants are hard to get, but substitutes they're like unicorns. So that's a challenge.
Is there you were mentioning like short-term disability, long-term disability, when the teacher's out, is there an insurance policy that the town has? that pay for
That's,
that?
it's not unemployment insurance. That's a whole different thing when you're injured on the job and you can no longer continue. Then we do have staff that access unemployment insurance. This is for long-term leaves and we do have differential substitute rates. So when you are in an assignment, and Alex can speak to this, that is longer than say 20 days and then longer than 80 days, you get paid an additional incremental rate so that we can attract the teachers that we need to do that. So.
So it's not necessarily true, though, that, part of where the savings or the give back comes in often is turnover, right? And that, so the substitutes would be used for that turnover, is there any correlation between a higher amount of substitute expense and then increased turnover, which would ultimately result in give back at the end of the year savings? Since the teachers that are being replaced are not being replaced, I guess, during the year, their salaries were in the budget, but you're not paying it.
I don't know if we've had trouble this year. Well, so not every position that goes out gets a substitute. And I think Alex can probably speak to this a little bit more than I can, but generally speaking, when there's a vacancy and we fill it with a permanent candidate. And if we can, we do find a substitute for them. Some positions don't, like maybe a guidance counselor you don't have a sub fit for them, but Alex can address that.
Yeah, we have, and I do think actually over the last years, I've seen an increase. Dick's question regarding increased FMLA, more people are out, more people are sensitive to their health. When someone leaves if they're leaving for a medical, then we are paying
Right.
while they're out if
Right.
they have
We had to pay the sub.
the sick time for that. If they're doing a leave of absence, sometimes we're able to hire someone who might be less expensive. So sometimes there is salary savings and sometimes there's salary savings because it takes time to fill positions when somebody exits. And we've had to hire for some really specialized positions. We've had to hire some retired folks that come in a little higher. Those are very carefully selected because they actually cost us,
Or go to a search for like a firm.
or go to a firm or get contracted services. So it depends. But I do think we have had some salary savings over the last couple of years because of people being out. But I don't necessarily know, Anne could speak to that, whether that is a huge salary savings.
When we do have an over under, sometimes it depends on the nature of the leave. If we have more medical leaves than parental leaves, we pay longer for both, for people who are out sick than we do for parental. So that can affect whether the net is a surplus or a deficit.
And I think we discussed this is the vacancies before. Sometimes a vacancy is, for instance, a special education position that could be funded through either circuit breaker or through salary savings elsewhere. My understanding from our discussion is that the preference is to fund that through the salary savings rather than the circuit breaker. Is that true? So if in the course of the year there's a vacancy.
We don't charge people directly to salary savings. We to circuit breaker. Circuit breaker is it's an amount of money that is applied to to a block of expenses. We don't one-off charge things to that amount. It becomes the funding source for instance, for tuitions as a whole. I don't know if that. It becomes a source of funding for expenses over budget. And that's sort of how we look at it and sort of how we treat it. It's not an intentional sort of funding source where we're like, I think I'm going to charge this to circuit breaker this day or this to salary savings this day.
But when you're reconciling in June at the end of the year, is that when you, at some point, you have to attribute the costs from circuit breaker? And does that all happen in June?
We do it throughout the year in quarters. When we receive that quarterly payment from the state, we receive our circuit breaker money in quarters from the state. We basically apply expenses as we get the money from the state to circuit breaker. And at the end of the year, if there is either we haven't gotten our fourth quarter payment yet, or we're looking and anticipating forward what our needs might be, then if we haven't, for instance, expended our fourth quarter expensed against our fourth quarter, we'll just let it ride over into the next year in the circuit breaker fund, and we just won't apply those expenses to circuit breaker, if that makes a sense.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question, and I apologize for coming in late, and if you answer this, I can get the information later, but the enrollment increase of 68, I'm just curious as to what sort of demographic insights relative to what was expected in the neighborhoods, or just, is there any learnings from where that came from, just for, as we think about other issues that affect parts of town, or that, is there anything specific that came about as a result of that increase that wasn't expected?
Well, and just, we are, and everyone, I'll make sure, Louise, that the invite goes out to everyone, but the demographer, we're having a Zoom meeting with him next Tuesday at 5 p.m. So we can, respond to some of these questions, but, he does expect that, sales in Needham are still happening and they're bringing people into the community. He said, that's a thing. He said, it's not a thing everywhere, but it's a thing in Needham.
You said that for a while. I just didn't know if that number was kind of expected, and if not, what sort of the actual or where it's coming from.
Sure. We know that the projection, there's a pretty significant change from the prior in the Sunita Williams neighborhood, in the Mitchell neighborhood. Primarily those two increases in those years. And he's attributed it to a number of factors. There is a lot of sales activity in those neighborhoods, that is bringing in people. That's the predominant reason. So those two are, and Sunita is already at capacity, so new families sometimes have to actually attend a different neighborhood school.
Anybody else?
I'm good. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for your help.
Thank you.
Yeah, and school committee,
We're happy to come back again if you're.
thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. Okay. I know, you feel, you have student performance and everybody leaves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Have fun the rest of the night.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, listen, you're bunch of steps ahead of me. Keep doing that.
Thank you.
Take care.
Good night.
Thank you.
We have a 2-hour discussion.
Yeah, the finance committee budget is on the agenda. Only Josh brought his book.
Oh,
That paper does.
You know, an extensive review.
We're pretty much.
5 pages?
So basically it consists of salary for one,
Right.
0.5 FTE. And then there are expenses that include, the dues for the, Association of Town Finance Committees, and then, some professional meeting fees for, the, ATFC annual meeting, which Karen went to this year, and the MMA annual meeting, which, Carol and I are going to later this week. And that's about it. And we also have office supplies covering the name. Karen's name plate. And that's about it.
So do you actually only want 35? I want to.
You know, I don't track, but I would say it's pretty accurate.
Okay.
Because it shifts.
assuming she's, if you spread it over the summer months too.
Exactly.
If that,
Right.
in season, it's a lot
I just
more.
want to make sure if it should be 0.75, if we make it 0.75, that's all.
Well, both the benefits and draw everyone to a loop. Yeah, no, I think that's pretty accurate. I mean, it balances out this time of year. It's a lot more than it is.
No, I
In
gather.
July.
I know, Sunday emails.
It seems to be a good time.
Thank you this year for posting everything on Google Drive. That's helpful.
Oh, well, that's working out, yeah. Carly suggested that.
Anything else on the agenda?
Well, Madam Chair, I'd like to go back on just a second on the school committee, school issues. I don't know whether you listened to the school committee meeting last night at all. But at the end, there was a discussion about building out the schools, and overwhelmingly, as one would guess, we have to do both right away, because if we wait, the costs are gonna go and something's gonna implode and so forth. So there's no question they'll be pushing strong for that, and I understand. I think we've got to get very creative on how we can deal with the Southern finance. Let me throw something out that may be totally inappropriate, illegal, but I'll throw it out. Could we build into their budget, say, you've got to take 500, 800, $1 million that you otherwise would have in your budget for operations, and put that towards the capital costs, these buildings, so having part of it, having the school department back off some of their wish list and join in financing the building. Because most businesses have to pay for their capital improvements themselves and so forth, and so it's not true in the town, I understand.
Well, it's not in their operating.
Well, but they're, their operating budget is what, seven?
No, but there's no principal and interest or.
I know, but they could put it in, they could put an element in, they could defer $1 million of what they would be asking for.
But that comes back to the question you asked last time, which is whether we can store future debt capacity somewhere within the budget.
Right.
And I'm not sure we can do that.
Well, that's what I say, it may not even be what I'm saying, but
Well,
if,
it's no
if their,
different
if their
than,
budget request is 90 for their normal operation, if they dial that down to 89, still have the $90 million budget, but $1 million of that is earmarked for,
Well, the only thing you could probably put it in is one of our reserve funds.
like a stable.
no, but it'll be actual expended. I mean, it's not reserved, once
You're
You're
not
saying
gonna
it's
spend
part
it.
of their budget as an expense.
part of the budget, and it will be paid out every year. Because you're gonna pay the
Well, but
interest.
there's still a project right now, so it couldn't be in this budget.
No,
No,
I'm just
no, no.
down the road as we
Right.
getting
Well,
this in,
But the reality is, you know what, they'll come in and
inflate the budget by
Right.
2 to cover the 1.
Well, they're not gonna vote your budget.
No.
In other words, their voted budget is what goes into the warrant.
Yeah, but
That's
we
under the
we can
bylaw.
wrestle back and forth and.
no, it's more about attaching ownership of some of the costs to their budget.
Yes,
I mean, in an accounting sense, not in a real. sense.
and that could be the cost of, getting it. Without that, they may not get to school.
But we haven't done that with any other capital.
Well,
project,
isn't that the
really.
mechanism for CPC debt? Where Community Preservation Act that is in, I mean, it's in total debt line item, but there's some portion that's attributed to.
But it's appropriate under the debt service line item.
Exactly.
Yes, and the funding source, which is one of the reimbursements to the general fund is CPA.
Because there's a different funding.
Yes,
source.
so if you look at the annual operating budget, they'll see that move that the sum of X be appropriate and the further that X is transferred from CPA, X is transferred from debt exclusion offset.
I don't think, I think this is much too complicated. I mean, if you have a project that people want to fund and you're trying to figure out where we're going to get the money to fund it, which I understand, then I think the answer is you have to make a decision. Are you going to go over 3%? Because you're still, or 10%, whatever the cap is. And then you can put the money, you can put it into townwide expenses. And you can reduce their request by that similar amount. You could also put the money in now, you could park it into one of our reserve funds. For the specific purpose of being available when and if a project, is presented.
We have that mechanism now,
That's what I'm saying. I think those opportunities are here now.
but the reality is, and I think the right way to look at it is it's gonna, in effect, crowd out everybody's
Yeah.
access to capital, access to operating. So, and there's, the give and take because of that. I mean, I don't disagree with that.
I guess what
Theory.
triggered it in my mind is I saw a item in there for a stipend for a snowboard instructor. And it just drove me crazy. I mean, we're paying for snowboard instructors and I think that was one that they ended up cutting, but it was in there for a while.
I think so I think that's a good question. I think another question is what really is the force and effect of our debt management policies? I mean, is town meeting obligated by those? I don't think they are. It's not in a bylaw, right? It's not in a bylaw. I don't think it is.
Well, that's,
So what if they voted a budget, which included principal and interest in the townwide expenses, which means that we went over 3%?
Say so.
So that's where you're gonna see the rubber meet the road then. Or the 10% level is blown through, and we're saying, can't do it, you can't do it, you can't do it. Town meeting says, we're gonna do it.
No, it's clear they can, legally, they can be. done.
Right.
What I'm just trying to say is, we need to be extremely creative in where we can find the money to pay this.
Or.
Because
help
even
with-
if we say we're gonna go over the, number, we're gonna go to 12, where the hell do we get the money to cover that?
Or stretch it out.
That's why the better alternative is to come up with an agreed upon financing plan. That, and I'm assuming that's what John and Louise are working, on, right, I think.
Ultimately too, because all those capital items are gonna be excluded. Ultimately, it comes down to not just town meeting. But
The voters.
But the voters deciding whether they wanna tax themselves to
Yep.
cover it, to pay for it. You can. You could agree to. Tax your, double your taxes, to get whatever you want, if people agree to it.
We usually talk about that in terms of the average, burden on the average. Is average the right number or should it be median?
Well, in the case of real estate, residential real estate taxes, the average and the median are not much different.
Okay.
On commercial property, there's a significant
Yeah.
difference.
That makes sense. Nobody, it's funny, I know a lot of towns debate, we really don't debate the issue of maximizing the differential between commercial and residential. A lot of towns are very reluctant to do that, get a lot of pushback from, we don't.
Gordon, quick announcement. So before this meeting, I attended the meeting about the Foster Estates, Castle Farm. There was a little new information, so there's a development agreement that's currently in negotiations and revisions that's due to be released early to mid-February. And the seller has allowed the purchase and sale agreement between the developer and the seller to be released, but only with redactions. So redactions will also include the sale price being redacted. So there's several pieces of information we want now.
Okay, anything else?
No.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Second, then my second.
Second them.
Do we have to do a thing?
I think we do. Let's take a vote. Karen,
Yes.
Yes.
Barry,
Yes.
Jim,
Yes.
Josh,
Yes.
and the temporary chair votes. I think that